Tonight's session is entitled, "Is there a local road to socialism?" And I'm going to look at it historically, although I will bring the discussion pretty well up into the 21st century. But there's a long history in the labor movement, both in this country and in other countries in Europe, and actually in North America. Indeed, in North America, there's quite a long history of socialists gaining control of municipal and local institutions. So this debate about the relationship between local struggles, the use of councils and local authorities as a way to pursue a socialist agenda is, I think, quite an important one. I think there are two themes that I'd like to draw out, and they're actually quite closely related, although, as I think we will see, at times they diverge, and in a few cases they do really, the tensions between them become, I think, rather unbearable. The first one is an idea that there is a specifically sort of local road to socialism. In other words, that socialists can gain control of local institutions and can begin some form of transformative politics. I mean, a good example of that at the moment, one that was given a lot of coverage in the run-up to the general election and got coverage in all sorts of places, from The Economist through to the New Statesman, Guardian, obviously, but also various local government magazines, is the so-called Preston model, and that this in turn was linked to various experiments both in Europe and North America. And this is the idea that through the actions of local governments, that you can begin some form of transformation, some sort of movement towards socialism. The issue, of course, is the definition of socialism, and also about how radical that transformation is. Now, this idea has, I think, a long precedence in Britain. It goes back at least to the 1880s and could be said to fit in with a policy often derisively referred to as gas and water socialism that was initially adopted by the liberal politicians in the city of Birmingham, particularly Joseph Chamberlain. So there's an idea that the local state, as it were, that you can carry out all sorts of reforms and you can actually make positive improvements in people's lives, and that will then build incrementally into some sort of socialist change. The second approach, which is the one that's more often, I think, referred to now, particularly on the left, is of course the idea of using local authorities, using the local state councils to mobilize and campaign for socialism. In other words, to use it as a platform to gain a majority on the council for a particularly radical program, usually involved with resisting cuts. And the two examples that I referred to in the introduction, the role of Poplar Council in East London in the early 1920s, and then the Liverpool City Council in the 1980s with the so-called militant council, though I'll explain that that's probably not entirely accurate, but we'll come back to that. And this would be the idea of forms of defensive struggles, particularly against reactionary governments who were attempting to cut local government budgets and attack the living standards of the working class population. And this, you can see that there is a connection between the two. You can see, for example, that in the case of Poplar, that in the earlier stage, there was an attempt to extend an agenda, for example, to carry out policies around the pay of local government employees, to improve other sorts of social conditions. So it wasn't entirely defensive, but so it has sort of two elements in it. I think the Liverpool example is possibly a little different in that it has those elements of defense, but also I think it is seen, or was seen, and has become something of an example of the way that local authorities could be used, it's suggested, to be you know, a mobilizing point in this way. Just by way of sort of general explanation, I'm covering a very long time period, and of course local authorities and what constitutes the council, you know, has changed over that period considerably. Really up until the 1940s, until 1948, the local government franchise was actually limited. It was limited to a body of people referred to as ratepayers. For those of us of an older generation, we'll remember the existence of these group of people. These were local taxpayers. They were either property owners or they rented property of a certain value. And it meant that in many areas, the poorest sections of the working class didn't have a vote. So if a council was elected that, for example, wanted to extend various welfare provision or housing, or even to pay decent wages to employees, it was often doing so on behalf of the poorest sections of the population, and those rates would fall upon the wealthier groups. And indeed, there was something of a cliche, and indeed they even were organized politically, a group of people called ratepayers, who were usually of a very, well, not usually, entirely of a conservative nature, who resisted the idea of such fripperies as providing medical care or hospitals or even decent schooling or education. So it's very much a stereotype of that type of person. So local government then is a battleground. The right to vote in elections and to stand in elections, still up until 1948, is connected to a certain extent with your social status. So in the case of Poplar, we're talking about the electorate's much bigger, but it's still not entirely universal. And there are still these elements, you know, of a class nature in local government. The other point is that up until the 1945, 1948, many of the functions that we now think of as the welfare state in Britain are provided locally. And indeed, back into the late 19th century, many social services, for example, hospitals, schooling, healthcare, even some forms of children's services, and of course, the limited forms of local government housing would have been provided locally, and that elected bodies, such as the boards of guardians, would administer the poor law, and the school boards, elected school boards, would control education. In other words, much of what we nowadays regard as almost sort of out of the realm of local administration was then very much into the centre. So when people began to argue that, for example, taking control of a local council and you could actually, you know, bring changes in people's lives, up until the 1940s, that was very much the case. So from the 1880s, when groups of socialists began to argue that you should organize collectively, stand for elections, many of them did so with the aim of gaining control of this local state. And the group that this policy perhaps closest to, it would be the Fabian movement. And indeed their policy of permeation, their policy of the inevitability of gradualness, all of these policies were a suggestion of a sort of piecemeal movement towards socialism. Now, the way that this would occur, they suggested, was that society was, capitalist society was in a sense socializing, that capitalism had moved from individual capitalism through towards monopolistic forms, which were in a sense socialized. So you had a socialized form of economy, but in individual ownership. So alongside this type of development, almost a sort of inevitable development, they assumed that forms of political action could help this new society to be born. So in a sense, they were midwives, very gradualist midwives, who would help the new society to come into existence. And the ways that they might do this would be to influence policymakers, to use the modern jargon, so that they would persuade politicians, administrators to assist the development of various forms of collective enterprise or to carry out social reform. So bodies like the London County Council, where they worked with liberals in what became known as the Progressive Alliance, the London School Board, these are all areas where quite important practical reforms were carried out. And so you can see this idea of a practical agenda, as opposed to arguing that society couldn't be transformed without a thoroughgoing revolution or a thoroughgoing transformation. This was the idea of gradual piecemeal reform in this way. And this Fabian tradition picked up from the 19th century tradition of gas and water socialism and sort of took it through. So when Labour started to emerge as a party in the early 20th century, there was already a model of local government. There were also continental and American models that people could draw on. When I did some research work on socialist politics in the early 20th century in Lancashire, the Social Democratic Federation and the ILP both used to issue monthly bulletins with around about 20 to 30,000 copies going to all the houses in the district. And they had a municipal program, which essentially was one in which they would argue they would pay decent wages to council employees, that they would extend the direct labour, the local government building department, that they would introduce decent lighting, sanitation, and they also did the same thing in terms of schooling, campaigned in these ways. So there's quite an established pattern of this. And this tradition, I think, was one that was based upon an initial argument that you could not, for example, expect to elect a Labour government, or indeed to get widespread change at a national level, but at a local level, you could in fact carry out this form of change. So this Fabian gas and water socialism, was well established, by the time of the First World War, and of course it would also provide a model for the Labour government, the first Labour government in 1924, and indeed when socialists began to take control of councils, which they did quite early on. In parts of East London, there were joint SDF and ILP majority councils as early as the 1890s. So this was quite an established pattern. Now, this of course will feed through into the rest of the 20th century. And I suppose the way that Labour develops in local government and the way that socialists attempt to use local government, can be seen very clearly. Increasingly, council housing, which is a development between the wars, and indeed is a development which is supported by conservative and liberal governments. It's not, local Labour councillors and others carry these programs out locally, but the legislation to enable them to do this, comes down centrally. So the models are, fairly well there. But where we start to see this idea maybe of of local government as as some sort of platform, as indeed where it might be used to mobilize, and perhaps more importantly, where it became a model for this later on, is of course in Poplar in East London in the early 1920s. And this is, I think, a good example of where maybe a struggle goes beyond the initial aims of the councillors, and in some ways it becomes more than itself. To simplify quite a complex situation, or what could be potentially a complex situation, the Labour Council is faced with a number of choices, and in particular, it's faced with the choice of increasing local taxation, and that will obviously cut into the living standards of many of its voters. It's also asked that many of its allegedly unrealistic policies of paying wages. It, for example, was paying some of its workers £4 an hour, which is quite a lot of money in 1921 and 1922. So it's put under pressure to sort of row back from that, and they refuse, and particularly they refuse by refusing to pay their contribution to other forms of local government inside the London area. This is particularly because other boroughs, other parts of London don't, are wealthier. For example, Westminster in the sort of southwest of London, so it's a wealthier area, and they argue that they're being asked to pay money to pay for example, the Metropolitan Police and the London School Board and Board of Guardians and so on. They're being asked to pay this at the expense of their voters, of working class people. And so they refuse to pay, the courts become involved, they're ruled against by the court, they refuse to carry out the payments, and they're sent to prison. And indeed, they go off to prison at the head of a big demonstration. There's a campaign of demonstrations, and the whole argument of refusing to carry out policies that will affect their voters and affect the services in the area. Now, there is eventually a compromise. They do row back somewhat, but they have established this precedent, this idea that rather than attacking local services, rather than putting up rates, they will actually stand firm, even up to and including the point of going to prison. The campaign is a successful one. It involves demonstrations. It involves some clashes with the police. It has all that that turbulence of the early 1920s. And I suppose the key point is that in considering this struggle, we're also considering what's going on, around in Europe, in Britain at the time, the campaign against the Russian Revolution, the industrial unrest, the war in Ireland. In other words, this is taking place in a period of some political, turbulence, and Poplarism fits into that. So you can see that it comes out of a particular Labour tradition of using local authorities to improve conditions, but there's also a sort of a militant element in this as well. The leader of Poplar Council is George Lansbury, who will later go on to be the leader of the Labour Party, and he will gain this reputation of being sort of incorruptible and a defender of the working class and so on. And he still is, I think, revered in that way. I suppose the issue, and we might want to consider here, is whether that struggle could have been broadened, whether, for example, it could have been linked in other ways to other struggles and other battles going on at that time. Criticisms both at the time, his son and daughter-in-law were members of the Communist Party and were in support of many of these programs, but they made criticisms of the limited nature of the campaign, and indeed there's an extensive literature, contemporary literature around how this struggle could have been taken forward. But the important point is that this is sort of becomes a case study, and it will be referred to again and again. Indeed, in the early 1980s, I think it's Noreen Branson published a book on Poplar, just in time for what will be our next and possibly last episode, judging from the clock, the events in Liverpool. And this book, I think, appeared in 1982, and I remember it being much discussed. There was something of a tradition in the 1970s of similar types of resistance to, for example, central government diktat towards local councils. And again, one that was fairly famous in the early 70s was Clay Cross, which was a small urban district in North Derbyshire, which refused to implement the Housing Finance Act. And the Housing Finance Act was again an attempt by the central state to insist that local authorities, tax services, in this case, to put up rents to what were referred to as fair rent levels, and again an attack upon working class living standards, to shift the burden of expenditure by the state onto the backs of working class voters. And this again is another pattern. What increasingly happens from the 70s on into the 80s will be that the state centrally attempts to attack many of the services, and particularly to cut back on that welfare state, which has grown considerably during the 20th century. So that housing, particularly council housing, working class housing, has become a very important issue. A personal anecdote: as a student, I went to work in Claycross for a couple of weeks during a series of election campaigns. John Dunn, I think some of the comrades on the Labour Left Alliance may know, was one of the councillors. They went through a series of elections where one group of councillors were surcharged and thrown out of office, and they went through a series of these patterns. Dennis Skinner's brother David was also one of them, and it became something of a cause célèbre. What's interesting, of course, is as with Poplarism, was the role of the Labour Party nationally, which failed to back them up. And although there was considerable support amongst Labour activists, the Labour leadership nationally took, I think, a fairly legalistic approach, which again is going to be something I'm sure that will come up in discussion. In other words, there are limits to the sort of actions that socialists who are councillors can carry out, that you're bound by various legal restrictions. If central government lays down a law, then ultimately you can't confront it. That's the law, and no further shall you go on this matter. The last area I want to look at is, of course, the 1980s, the one that's much closer to our own time, and probably many of the older comrades here will remember it fairly well. I hope that there are some Liverpool comrades in the meeting, and they'll be able to come in with personal memories of this period. I wasn't living in the city at that point, so I viewed these things from afar, although I had lived on Merseyside in the late 70s into the early 80s. The so-called militant council is an interesting development, because in some ways it was part of a wave of struggles involving local authorities across Britain in the 1980s, when the Conservative government attempted to cut local government spending. And again, the point I'm making here about context is that the 1980s are a period of great industrial struggles, obviously the great miners' strike of 84 to 5, but a whole series of local struggles about cuts in local government expenditure, particularly on housing. And this is occurring in a period when many cities are facing job losses, facing the decline of industries, and this is a period of great unemployment and so on. Now, Liverpool was in some ways very typical, but in other ways not. Liverpool's decline as a city had been occurring fairly continuously since the 1930s, and by the 1970s, it was clearly, as a book of the time referred to, a city in crisis. So the attacks which were going on across local government had a particularly important impact, I think, in Liverpool. What made Liverpool different from any number of other local authorities, Labour authorities, both in London, for example, in Lambeth under Ted Knight, GLC under Ken Livingstone, Sheffield under David Blunkett. What made Liverpool, I think, slightly different was not only the depth of the decline, but also that the council which had taken control of the city, had done so on a fairly left-wing program. And the program was one of building houses, of improving services. In other words, this wasn't just a defensive struggle. It had all those elements that I referred to before of attempting positive reforms, positive changes in the interests of the working class, particularly in terms of housing and particularly in terms of the development of various local services. So this wasn't purely a defensive argument. It was one around using the local state as an instrument, to change lives. It also, I think, was different in that the left was a different type of left in Liverpool to maybe in other parts of the country. It's often referred to as a militant council, and although the militant group, the Trotskyist group was widely influential and in many ways was the leadership, it never had a majority of Labour councillors, and indeed, figures are unclear, particularly in these witch hunting days, although there were witch hunting days in the 1980s as well, but probably no more than about 13 out of 47 of the councillors were committed members of the militant group. But you did have a much broader left, and more importantly, you had a broader left outside in the city, in the district Labour Party. And so this strategy of pushing the government, of taking expenditure, of refusing, for example, to implement cuts, of arguing that the city needed X amount and that therefore this had to be granted by local government, this strategy did have widespread support. And rather like the Poplar movement, there were large demonstrations. I was personally at a demonstration in, I think, 84, which may well have had 50 to 60,000 people on it. It was a very large demonstration. Now, the same issues, I think, arise in relation to both the Labour leadership, again, the famous Neil Kinnock speeches, his hostility to this type of strategy, but also the hostility of even many of the other lefts to this type of strategy. And indeed, at various crisis points, other parts of the movement left Liverpool isolated. But there's also, I think, another point about the strategy and about a debate about the strategy. And this is why I hope comrades will come in. I've had to summarize what I think is a very complex set of developments and, not really done it justice. But for example, some of the strategies adopted in order to buy time, various expedients were used. The famous one, which Kinnock highlighted in his conference speech, this use of redundancy notices, this idea of saying, look, the city is approaching bankruptcy, this is the government's fault, and trying in a sense to sort of shift the blame, which was quite true. It was the government's fault for not providing the resources. But the question was that strategy, I think, confused, divided many people, and indeed, when Kinnock and the Labour right counter-attacked, the Liverpool left and the Liverpool councillors found themselves isolated. They had to retreat, and very quickly a general witch hunt set in. Indeed, this period in the late 80s, following on from the events of 84 and 85, saw something of a really generalized witch hunt against the militant group and other left-wingers. So these two examples are very much on the left, the use of the council to mobilize. They appear to be successful. They appear to get quite widespread support. But the question then is raised, well, where do we go from here? How do we link up? And one of the problems with the municipal left of the 1970s and 80s was that this municipal left was by no means united. And indeed, I think that Liverpool found itself isolated. We're also in the period of the miners' strike, the failure to link up with that dispute and so on, shows, I think, some of the dangers or some of the problems of this particular tactic. One one last area I just want to just to touch on in conclusion is really another theme of local socialism, which has actually come up. And in many ways, if some of the people who joined the meeting may well have expected more on this than maybe the more militant struggles. But this is the idea now that local authorities can be some means of if not transforming capitalism, at least ameliorating some of its effects. And this particularly is the so-called Preston model, although it's part of a set of policies that go on in other places, other local authorities, and again, it's drawn on models in the United States. Now, unlike the earlier municipal socialists, and particularly Labour councillors from the 20s onwards, who had considerable powers over areas like housing, education, and health, these models accept really the limited role of contemporary local councils. Local government financing is now dominated by the central state, and indeed its ability to act independently, either because of financial constraints or more importantly because of legal constraints. You know, the Tories and indeed New Labour have learned from these earlier struggles and have really hemmed in local councils. This model, particularly the idea of so-called community wealth development, are, you know, as the phrase says, fairly nebulous, and indeed in many ways are nothing more than an attempt to channel certain sorts of spending, to encourage cooperatives, to encourage various community involvements. They're not, I think, even as radical as the old gas and water socialism, which attempted, for example, in housing and health, to really make dramatic changes. And the Preston model, I think, accepts the limitations that all it can do is to maybe channel some funds from public bodies, the so-called anchor institutions, that you can channel those funds, you can encourage public bodies to spend money in the particular area, you can encourage through leasing buildings and equipment, you can encourage cooperatives. But the idea of even as radical a change as the Fabian suggested, you know, isn't really part of this agenda. So this is, I think, where we are. Whether struggles of the sort that emerged in the 80s and the 70s or the 20s can occur again, I think very much depends on the context, but it also depends on the conscious strategy of socialist councillors and how they view their role. The left, because of the ravages of Blairism and indeed the witch hunt from the 1980s, the left is probably most weakly organised and recognised in local authorities. So socialist councillors are a very tiny minority. And of course, building them up, often building up your municipal strength, often takes a long period of time. The rise of the left in Liverpool was easily the product of 30 years' work in the 1980s. So we can see that that as an arena of struggle, it's not an area that we can very quickly get into. But Tina's quite right. Local government and the struggles around the public sector, around defensive services, will become very important. But it's that relationship between those local struggles and the national picture, which I think is very important. And whether this tradition of using the local state either as a place to mobilize or as an arena for social change is still, I think, an important question, and one which I'm sure, as you know, as the left starts to reevaluate its politics, will come up again. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Kevin. As always, thought-provoking, and nobody noticed you only just woke up before the meeting. I'd say just quickly on that, it is interesting, of course, lots of people view, you know, the council going into council, becoming a councillor seems to be like almost a natural career path if you want to make a change in the Labour Party. But as I understand it, it's even easier to withdraw the whip from a councillor than it is from an MP. and they are under serious discipline, and it's very difficult to, you know, use council politics as a platform, as it were, because people are under so much discipline. If you're a local councillor, you're not allowed to basically say anything against what your council leadership is doing, your Labour group is doing anyway. So I'm bringing in a couple of people now from the floor. The first one is Andrew Ward. Hello.
Hi, comrades. I'm really thankful the Labour Left Alliance actually raising this issue, because it's very close to my heart. I was a militant. I mean, I was based in Brighton, and we used to go up to Liverpool to canvass and stuff like that. So I was very much impressed with what was happening at that time. Now the thing is, right, a lot of 1984 Labour conference, a lot of councils, there was a big popular front, a lot of councils getting together to take the government head on at that time. It wasn't just Liverpool, there was Sheffield, there was Islington, and also the GLC that time. But one by one, everybody bottled out, and now Liverpool and Lambeth isolated. That was the truth of the matter. But the problem was, I think, the United Front was actually looking at the idea of not setting a budget at all. Now, Millicent's original position was setting a needs budget. Then, but unfortunately, I think initially, as far as I remember, they all went for the initial thing of not setting a budget, and I think it was a tactical mistake, because it was a bit outside the ultra left. I think you're setting a needs budget, a budget of needs. Now the thing is, right, one by one bottled out. But I think that obviously you can look. Who was ahead of Sheffield? David Blunkett. Left. There was left opportunity in that time. You know, nice career move. You know, to be a councillor. When it comes to bottling now, you know, of course, ends up becoming sort of a minister in a new Labour government, and it's like the same with Margaret Hodge. So you can see the sort of people, they were left careerism, and it's left opportunism. It's trendy to be left. When it comes to nitty gritty, everybody bottles out, and then, you know, allows the true socialists to be totally isolated. But I think at the end of the day, I mean, I think that was the problem in the Corbyn years. Was that, you know, John McDonnell's, you know, councillors mustn't break the law by setting these budget, you know, but set a budget, you know, just publish a budget, what is really needed, but not actually take the government head on. And I think that is a very tactical mistake, because in the day, I think what led to Labour's defeat in 2019 was Labour doing bad in local elections, because it's not good enough to say, oh, there's nothing we can do, blame the Tories. People are not in, you know, people are not falling for that argument any longer. You can't, you know, it has to be. And I think the problem is Labour councils, the whole idea of Labour councils are an existential crisis. So I think it's got to the point where people have to get together. And it's only like the poll tax situation. If every Labour council refused to set the poll tax, we could have brought the government down even then. I really do think, I mean, obviously, I don't think you can have local, you know, local councils getting together. It's not going to have socialism on its own. But it's linking the trade union movement as well. It's bringing the trade union movement together locally, working with the councils, and then looking at the national situation, like the miners' strike. Because I mean, if the Labour council took together and we're the miners' strike at that time, that would have pulled the Thatcher government down, because Thatcher government was close to capitulation over the miners' strike. And then don't forget, there was the stance of the Liverpool Council actually got some money back that was stolen from them. But I think the problem was, it's like they end up being isolated, and the betrayal of Neil Kinnock, who's the biggest class traitor since Franklin MacDonald. Then that speech caused a lot of distortion as well, and they were fake redundancy notices anyway. But anyway, I've said enough for now.
Thank you, Andrew. I think the 2019 defeat might as well have something to do with the national campaign against Jeremy Corbyn and the left.
I think the council thing started. The council thing didn't help either. You know what I mean? You know, it was you know. Anyway.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, Matthew, you look very pixelated.
That picture looks pretty awful.
I'll bring in Peter first, yeah, because you look like from mine work. Okay. Hello, Peter.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Right. Yeah, I was just going to, hi Kevin, thanks for that. I was just going to, you know, what militant means to me in those years is kind of a raising of consciousness. So, that, you know, you initially started out by asking the question and think about, do we see in these, you know, municipal socialism, a local socialism, the practical route of socialism, or do we see it as a set of ideas which can be used and inspired? I think that's possibly what you mentioned there. And for me, it was, you know, I was a car mechanic, shop steward at the time, and in Liverpool, and it certainly raised my consciousness levels. So militant going on strike, the miners closely next to them on strike, made me think about like the possibilities for socialism for the first time, and it changed my attitude to being a trade unionist, you know, and what I expected as from members as shop stewards. It radicalised me in terms of, you know, the socialist ideals. But what I soon learned, you know, around the time and thereafter, that you're not going to get socialism through municipal politics. Militant made some serious errors, you know. Ideologically, they were a dramatic inspiration at the time, but they made serious errors, which is based on maybe their ideas of socialism, but also what I learned, and I've learned since, that these kind of initiatives or defence mechanisms, and you mentioned about the context, and the context is really key. During the militant rise that was against the end of social democracy and a kind of defensive mechanism against Thatcherism, and they were at the sharp end, as you mentioned as well, within Liverpool, of being a branch plant economy, which suffered very severely from the you know, the downturn after during the mid 70s to late 79, which led to Thatcherism. Their privatisation agenda, which followed. Liverpool had a high employment rate amongst the public service sector, and in the private sector, as you just mentioned, a branch plant economy. So it was easy to pull a plug for these global organisations. Like Ford made quick and rapid changes to production rationalisation at the time in the Tailwood plant, and lots of firms around Kirby and Huyton, global firms, were able to make cuts. And so Liverpool at the sharp end of that. But you know, for me, it was about a battle of ideas. I've since come to look at this as a kind of fight over use value and exchange value in Marxist terms, and that militant were on a rearguard action, trying to maintain really a kind of conservative way the core of social democratic leanings towards public goods, and you know, the expansion of socially useful things and needs as in opposition to, you know, exchange value in the private sector. And there was some sort of compromise during the social democratic phase over that, where use value, social need, public services, nationalisation, utilities, things you mentioned there, are all for me like areas of policing by the Labour Party. And militant were a kind of rearguard action, trying to maintain that policing of use values and social need against the backdrop of a very, very changed circumstances, politically and economically. And they were on a hiding to nothing, both in terms of going to the banks to secure a loan to take care of the rate cap at the time, instead of mobilising their support and stretching out to the miners and really beginning to integrate and widen their struggle with the miners there. They went for a long deal. And the miners' policy itself was a recipe for defeat. And that's no surprise, because the politics behind Scargo was very much of the same ilk as militant, you know. And that was a defence of jobs, a regulation of the labour market, the use of industrial relations to strengthen wages, to create a social wage, to break commodity fetishism, but maintain the existence, you know, maintain a kind of socialism, which is really about the underpinning the socialisation of capital, you know, and that's really what it was. Capitalism was socialised, and there's a lot of areas that it kind of became it couldn't, you know, it either didn't want to make profit from or couldn't make profit from, and that was overtaken, taken up by the rest of society, and with all sorts of public works and that kind of thing, and the rise of the public sector, nationalisation and welfare and all that. But yeah, so my main thoughts, and what I thank the 80s for, is for politicising me and making me turn towards Trotsky and Marx and understand what capitalism is, and understanding that these kind of debates will go on and on and on unless you really get down to discussing what socialism's about, instead of kind of assuming that we all know what it's about and then having a debate around, should we, you know, in what sense is sort of a local council socialism, municipal socialism, socialism struggle able to be successful or not. We have to have a debate about what socialism means, and for some it means helping capital to socialise an agenda, and that's what it's certainly been used for. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I think you just talked yourself into presenting
I stand still.
the webinar. Okay, Matthew, let's try you again. It still looks strange, but just go ahead. I think we could hear you. You look a bit like
okay. Sorry, no, I think
Minecraft,
the net here has been pretty awful all day. I've been trying to work with it, so it's a bit painful. But I think that the interesting thing about this is, of course, obviously that you've got a long history of it, and you're working through, you know, essentially what are the local parts of the capitalist state. I mean, the problem is really that people don't see the hostility. You know, the basic issue that you know, as Marx points out from the Paris Commune, his lesson in the Paris Commune is you cannot simply take over pieces of the state or pieces of the state and use them for your own purposes, because the thing actually is organized for something else. The working class actually has to take the thing apart and start again. It does create, I mean, I think that, you know, what are the other thing that really strikes me about the whole business of taking on local government is you need a strong organization. I mean, the problem is, I think that the difference is, of course, that you know, those people who go in to being councillors as individuals without an organisation behind them are automatically basically sucked into the process and basically just you know, either spat out again or you know, become incorporated into the thing itself. So you need, I mean, you know, if you look at any of the successful efforts of any description, you know, whether that's the likes of the ILP in Glasgow or the, you know, the Poplar organisation or in Liverpool or whatever else, it's backed with a strong organisation, you know, locally and nationally. I think the other thing, of course, is that, I mean, the thing is that the local government in Britain, of course, is not particularly local. In fact, all the money comes centrally. The control is deeply, you know, with essentially from the centre. Essentially, councils are designed to take orders, and this has become more so over time. And you know, you talk about you know, the whole business from 1948 onwards. The bulk of local government money actually comes from central government grant. Local governments don't actually have a great deal of means of actually raising money. You know, you then have the likes of the poll tax. You know, the effort by Thatcher to use the poll tax essentially as a means of loading more burden onto the working class, and its current replacement with the council tax, which is a basically been put together on the back of a fag packet. You can quite clearly see it. I mean, it's something just been put together in as an emergency offer to hold the thing together. And the only, you know, the thing is that they're too frightened to even amend that. I think when they tried to re-rate in Wales, there was outcry because obviously it changed the whole nature of the burden, and of course they're terrified to do anything about it. So even the council tax is based on 30-year-old property values. I mean, it's bizarre. It really gets completely bizarre. The organisation and operation of local government in this country. I think, you know, the other thing, of course, is that, you know, in terms of the operation, is the difference between what you would do as a socialist and the record of social democracy itself, the record of the Labour Party, which is at best awful. I mean, you can see. I mean, the impact, of course, you can see in the fact that if you're lucky, 40% of people vote in local government elections. I mean, usually it's far less than that, because they can see clearly that these people councillors don't actually deliver anything, they don't represent them. You know, essentially they impose the diktats of the centre, they attack, have spent the last, you know, however many decades attacking the service users and workers and so on. And you get down to the situation, say, we had in Glasgow recently, where it was revealed that the Labour Council, in alliance with the unions, had managed to swindle the majority of their own workforce out of in excess of £500 million in the equal pay they were entitled to. And of course, those women, including my wife, will never see that money back again. They got a piece of it, but they didn't get anything like all of it. You know, and that's the way that these things are run. And so, really, I mean, the problem is, you know, you have to approach it really as something you would look at as being a cesspit, and that you would actually sort of say, well, you know, look, we're going to do things completely differently. You need to build an organisation which can do things about it. You need to say, look, you know, we will work on the basis of needs-based budgets, etc. And what we are doing in going into these things is not running them. It's actually building a revolt. It's the only thing you could do, because they're in such an awful state, and essentially just a you know, a cover for the actual need. I mean, if you looked at the actual need which exists in a place like Glasgow, I mean, it is a sort of social catastrophe in this city. You know, you could pile vast amounts of resource in, and then you might start to get hold of some of the issues and the problems that exist for the bulk of the population. But what exists now is a travesty. It's a complete travesty, and you'd have to say that. You have to say that, and have to say, you know, this is the nature of where we stand. You know, and be absolutely radical about it. You know, and I think it's got. I mean, the Preston thing is just again, it is itself a travesty. All it is redistributing a bit of money, you know, on a sinking ship. You know, it doesn't get you anywhere, I don't think. I mean, our project has to be something completely different. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. To make matters worse, as somebody puts in the chat just now, many councils are now being threatened with bankruptcy, of course, through COVID and the whole economic crisis that's coming there, and having invested, being advised to invest in all sorts of crappy schemes that are now, of course, not paying out. I suggest I read one more question out, and then bring Kevin in before I bring in some other people. This is from David Hawkins, who thinks our discussion so far has been a bit negative, and surely local government ought to be more than resistance to central government. What about a vision that local people should be able to decide about local issues? If local Labour politicians can fight to improve housing and public transport, that can do a lot to build confidence in socialism. Does Labour have to be so very centralizing in its vision, which is not a bad question. Of course, socialism is about self-rule, and that also is about local self-rule, of course. But back to Kevin.
Okay, thanks, Tina.
We're already at 7 o'clock, and there's 5 people still who want to speak. So if you could keep it to, you know, 7-8 minutes, perhaps, that'd be great. Thank you.
Response to a couple of points there. I was very pleased to hear the comrades who had some sort of direct experience, like Peter and Andrew, and also a comrade on the message on the chat box, or the question and answer, Graham, who made reference to Arthur Scargill actually coming to Liverpool, and so on. He says he has memories of walking across Lime Street with him. So I think there was some good sort of personal experiences there. Peter's point about consciousness raising, I think, is an interesting one, as is his point about social democracy. as ever, I always think of the important points to say after I've begun my introduction. But I think one of the things I was trying to do with the contextualization and to talk about the development of local government over the longer period was, I suppose, in a way, to locate the growth of the welfare state and indeed then its destruction or its transformation into something else, and to see the strategy of Labour councils or indeed the Labour movement in response to that. So I think your points about a sort of defensive struggle, I think, are quite important. And I think looking back at that period, which of course it perhaps wasn't as clear in the midst of the 1980s, is that we were suffering, tremendous defeats, and that there was then going to be, a very long period of defeat, and indeed, deindustrialization, the destruction of many of the gains of the working class, and so the local authorities and the resistance there was in many ways a sort of a last stand, I think, for that type of politics, and it was framed, I think, as being the case with some movements in the recent period of defending the 1945 settlement. Now, in some ways, it's quite good to argue for the defence of services, and in particular to say to people that, the needs of this city, the needs of the population mean that we have to spend X amount of money, and the government is giving us this amount of money, and to draw that contrast. But I think that purely framed in defensive terms and not, for example, linked to a wider movement for the transformation of society, then I think it becomes problematic. I suppose it's linked to this idea of how we build a socialist movement. And I'm sure that the militant comrades were arguing that this would be a consciousness raising, that people would learn through struggle. And, Peter's correct, I'm sure many people did. But whether Britain in the 1980s was on the edge of revolution, or whether long-term gains could have been made through that form of struggle, I think is open to question. It is an important question of tactics, about not only about our demands but about the way that we raise those demands, and about the nature of our ideas of socialism. And I think Peter, hit some of that quite well there in that way. Roger Luffman, in one of the questions, made a point about being a councillor in various parts of Britain in that period, and talked in particular about the role of the leadership, as did Andrew, with references to people like David Blunkett and Margaret Hodge and so on, and in particular this argument of not breaking the law. The Liverpool council has had a slogan that it's better to break the law than break the poor, and that banner is still used. It still comes out. In fact, our Merseyside Labour Left Alliance meetings, we've had it as our sort of backdrop. So there's an important tradition in that, and that again I think shows some of the limits of a social democratic position, the sort of limits of how far you can go, and that again I think shows some of the limitations of the strategy. On David Hawking's point, David, I think you're in Berlin, and you'll be very well aware there, I'm sure, of the differences between German local government and British local government, and in particular the struggles in Berlin around housing, and particularly the role of Die Linke in government and so on. And I think the question that you ask is an important one, because I think our programme as socialists has to include a municipal, or a militant municipalism maybe, does have to include a municipal element. And so if we are in favour of socialism as being a conscious self-rule by the working class, then we are in favour of that type of local democracy. But I think we have to be careful to not just have a set of local utopias. In a discussion recently in the LLA, Chris Williamson was talking about his alternative political strategy, and he was talking about a grassroots movement, you know, building from the bottom up and so on. But I thought, in his view, and I only cite this as an example, is that often seemed to me to be quite localized, and it almost seemed to be socialism in one town or socialism in one ward. So I think our municipal program has to be one that does have the maximum of local self-rule. It does give, you know, powers to local government to carry out, you know, a program that reflects the needs and the interests of the local population. But that also has to be fitted into a democratic program for the state at large. And I think that too much of what social democratic parties have done is to simply take the machinery of state and to use it in that way. So I agree, and I think we should have quite a discussion on municipal policy, particularly in relation to things like housing and local planning issues as well. So that would be my response, David. But perhaps if you'd like to come in and talk about what your experiences have been in Berlin, I'd be very interested in that, to make a comparison in that way. Just lastly, Matthew, obviously your point about the Paris Commune is well made, and I'm sure that the militant comrades in Liverpool were well aware of it. Although whether they saw their struggle as being revolutionary or indeed as potentially revolutionary or purely defensive, I think is still open to discussion. I think, though, you do make some important points about tactics inside the Labour movement, and in particular, we have to think about building support for socialism that is a much wider definition of socialism than mere organizational maneuvers. And I think that we do need to ensure that we've got a very strong support base. If we take positions as councillors, or indeed if we become selected as MPs, we will come under tremendous pressure from not only from the state machine, but as the comrades have indicated here, from our own leaders. Indeed, our own leaders often act as parts of that state machine. And if they are, for example, telling us to obey the law, then they're giving an ideological pressure on us in that way. So organisation and making sure that we've campaigned and we've got solid support amongst the members. In other words, that our project isn't simply to take positions, but it's actually to build support amongst the membership and amongst the wider movement for socialist politics. You know, Matthew is quite right. It's often happens that within a matter of weeks of joining the Labour Party, if you've got any ideas at all, or you can string any sentences together, someone will say to you, oh, you should go on the council. And indeed, it's been the ruin of many a good socialist to go on to the council and find themselves either trapped as an isolated minority, or to be converted into a hack. And I think that, you know, the dangers of doing that, you know, are important, and we should, you know, should certainly learn from them. The record of Labour councils, you know, has been largely to accept the parameters of capitalist politics, of Tory governments, and often to implement the cuts, or in some other ways to finagle. And in some ways, the finagling and the manoeuvres and the pretense that they're not actually cutting things, or indeed that in some cases through various policies involving PFI and so on, that they're actually building council houses. The point about the contemporary state, and I have got the figures for Liverpool in front of me, and the Liverpool, you know, faces a particular crisis at the moment, given that in comparison with 2010, we've had something like a 63% cut in the budget, and the current coronavirus crisis, you know, will accentuate that. But the vast bulk of Liverpool's funds come from central government, and given the nature of the council tax and the business rates in this city, it's always going to be dependent on the government. And so that means that any policies of improvement, any policies of development are going to bring cities like Liverpool into direct conflict with governments that want to restrict budgets. And that means, I think, that taking control of councils, automatically brings us into that sort of confrontation. But I'll leave it there and perhaps sum up towards the end.
Thanks, Kevin. Next is Jonathan Cooper, please. Hi.
Oh, thank you, Tina. Comrades, I'm thinking, Kevin, what role do you think that that grassroots socialists can play in making municipal socialism possible? And do you think that actually municipal socialism can't just be concentrated in one part of the country, but should be spread out across the country? So that actually, and do you think that a federalist settlement actually gives would give regional assemblies more power over spending, would be the way forward for a future federalist settlement?
Thank you. I'll collect a few questions again before we bring Kevin back in. So Marion, please. Oh, you're still muted. Hold on. Can you unmute yourself, Marion? There you are. No, still not. Oop. Sorry. I tried to unmute you when you were doing it. Can you try again? Sorry, comrade. It's still muted. Sorry. There you go.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, in 79, I was living in Tamworth, moved up from London, and I got involved in the Labour Party up there. And I was working with a few comrades that were in the militant tendency at the time. And I can remember one of my first speeches was against the witch hunt at the constituency party, when which we didn't totally win, but we got quite a bit of support. But one of the things I've been giving it some thought, that I think, like during the miners' strike, the whole of the Labour movement didn't unite to ensure we won. Similar things were happening on the local authority level, where Lambeth, Liverpool were left then to be isolated, and therefore to enable Thatcher to get away with a lot more than she should have done. And I can remember eventually we managed to get the Labour back into local government in Tamworth. And I can remember having to have debates with people, because there was debates going on, and like some Labour councillors were saying, well, we should put up the rents because people would be able to get the money back from central government, so it wouldn't impact people. And I had to remind them, not everybody who's working class can get those benefits. So yes, you would be making working class people pay a heavy price for what you're doing. Not everybody gets would get like rent rebates, and you had to have quite a big argument with them on that. And then in '88, I moved to Birmingham, and they got involved a bit with the social campaign group, Birmingham Socialist Campaign Group, and we started organising and trying to, get some changes through. But then a bit later on, we set up in Birmingham the Birmingham Community Campaign, where we started opposing all the cuts, and we got quite a bit of support that way. But one of the lessons it taught me, that unless we get our trade unions to do what they should be doing more, and that we actually unite and work out, like maybe a needs budget, because we was arguing people should be setting deficit budgets because people have needs, and we shouldn't just accept it. And I think we need to give it some serious thought about how we actually can mobilise people, because I accept that you can't take over any part of the state really, but we've got to change people's consciousness, and we've got to build up to such a point where people think, yeah, we've got to overthrow the system. So it's about how you do that. What methods do you do? What ideas can you come up with to bring that forward? But I was really angry quite a few times, really, that even the trade union movement wasn't doing what it should have been in building up to stop a lot of what went on in leaving Liverpool and Lambeth isolated. I can remember having debates in the, I think we were the NCU then, the broad left, about these kind of things and what we needed to be doing to actually, you know, construct a movement that could actually not only defend our class and not only defend, but maybe be able to extend in certain areas. And I think we need to be looking at that. Yeah, we have to defend what we've already got, but we also have to be thinking about what other model do you want to put forward? How can we change things so that people get included and feel that they've got a role to play and they can input their ideas into the situation? So I think that, you know, we've got a lot to learn, and unfortunately a lot of the mistakes that we've just gone through as well, you know, and the role of some of the trade unions in what's gone on, Nichols or Mac Nichols or whatever he's bloody called, and some of the likes of them, you know, we've really got to hold them to account, because, yeah, I'll wind up now, but the key thing for me is how do we construct in all these different areas to bring about where people not only feel that they can change things, because that's the other thing, there's a lot of negativity and people think you can't change things. Well, yes, we can, but we have to unite around things to do it. So that for me is the key thing. How do we construct a situation to take things forward again?
It's going to be a little while, I fear, Mary. It's not good times at the moment. Okay, the next speaker from the floor, please. Sorry. Tony.
Tony, yeah. Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Tony.
Hi, comrades. My name's Tony Rimmer. I'm one of the Liverpool 47 surcharge Labour councillors in the 80s. So apologies for coming on a little bit late. I came in, I think, halfway through Peter's contribution. And the first thing I picked up from Peter was that we hadn't made any links with the miners during that period. And what you've got to remember is, in the 80s, in the 84, 85 period, when the miners' strike was on, it only lasted a year, and our kind of struggle went on from 83 to 87. Ours was a 4-year struggle, and we did make links with the miners. I've made some really great friends over that period who were miners, and I was actually the council liaison for Sutton Manor Colliery, which is just up the road from here, and we had other councillors as liaisons with some of the other pits, Bold Colliery and Point of Ayre in North Wales. And the idea of that was to make sure that the miners weren't suffering, that their families were being fed. If they needed anything, we were there to help them as best as we could. So we did build links with the miners, but not only that, we built links with other trade unions as well. But taking you back to that time, we had Neil Kinnock as the leader of the Labour Party. We got no support from Neil Kinnock in Liverpool City Council. His aim was to get rid of militant. He's seen militant in Labour, in Liverpool Labour, and he wanted rid of them. So we got absolutely no support from him, and the miners got no support from him. If you take you back to there, that there was no support from Kinnock towards the miners. And we actually came about just as a group of people. There was nothing special about us. We ended up on a council, all from different wards, all from different situations and reasons for being there. And how we ended up there, at the time there was a district Labour Party, and the district Labour Party, they set the policies for Liverpool City Council. Liverpool District Labour Party, when you went to be interviewed, if you were considered to go on the panel, there was a question that you were asked, and the question was, who do you consider to be the policy making body for Liverpool City Council? And if you didn't say it was the District Labour Party, you didn't get on that local government panel. Now that question is now gone as regards district Labour parties have gone. But I think there's a similar question that's asked of potential candidates now is, would they be prepared to break the whip? And obviously if they say yes, they're not getting on that panel. And what we've got to do as a left, if we've got any say in the people who are going on those panels, we've got to be sure that we're asking them, when you go on that panel, you go into that room, you get interviewed and you say, oh no, I'm not going to break the whip. but make sure when you get on that bloody council that you are prepared to break the whip. And that's what it's about. And it's about forming relationships amongst your Labour group, working together, building a campaign, going out on the streets, getting the people of whatever town or city to support you. We had mass demonstrations in Liverpool. People followed us and supported us. We were never unelected in Liverpool. We never lost an election in Liverpool. It took Thatcher and the district auditor to come and surcharge us and disqualify us. And I'll take you then into another situation, which obviously is a concern for any future, comrades who are in struggle and being faced with surcharge and disqualification. We went out ourselves and we went to all the trade union branches and we asked people to take out standing orders, and a campaign fund was put together, and we were able to pay off our surcharge by the kind donations of comrades from all over the country and around the world. We even got to the point where we could have paid the surcharge off about 7 years before we had to, but we decided to make them wait, and we kept the money in our bank and we trickled it to them when they asked for it. So it's all about building a campaign, and really it's about getting the right people, for me, onto the local government panel, getting them elected as councils and getting them prepared to make a stand. And not this thing about self-promoting really annoys me. These people who come into the Labour Party and they're in here 10 minutes and they think, oh, I wouldn't mind being a councillor, rather than what Kevin said, or someone saying, oh, you'd make a good councillor. That'd be great if someone was actually out there doing the campaigning and doing the business. But these people are coming in and they're saying, I wouldn't mind being a councillor. They're filling a form in, and the next thing they're on the council for some seat or other that that's quite easy for them to be accepted as a Labour councillor. And for me, that's all got to change. For me, it all ended up. It was all governed by the district Labour Party, and there's been talk of militants, and there's been talk of militants in Liverpool. Of those councillors, of the 47, or actually 49 councillors, because 2 died during the campaign, so we became known as the 47. But originally there were 49. I think there were maybe 8 or 10 who were in any way associated with militants. Not everybody on that council was a supporter of militants, but we reached the consensus on what we did by going in and talking about it, and coming out of that agreed on what we were going to do and a way forward. And that's what these councillors have got to do now. Not just go on there and put their hands up to make more cuts in, for jobs and services to go. A couple of nights ago, I was on a Zoom call with the leader of Sefton Council, and his comment was, enough is enough. Now, that was exactly the same comment that I used 36 years ago in my election address. So for 36 years, we've been having enough is enough and we keep accepting them. Nobody's making a stand. We tried and they came and they got rid of us. We've got to make a stand somewhere, and the rest of the Labour Party and the socialist movements have got to be prepared to support them. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Quite right. Last speaker from the floor is Alec Price.
Okay, yeah, fantastic speech by Tony. Fully agree with what he said. In terms of the district Labour Party, I think we need to bring them back. I think one of the issues that was kind of forgotten about during the Corbyn period, because the MPs were so bad, was that actually we've got local councillors who are basically like the sort of middle management of political capitalism, and they, in a lot of local areas, they basically run the roost. So they set the policy as a Labour group. They become the people that you have to apply to become a councillor in the first place, so it can become very self-selecting. So I think we need to get rid of all that and bring back in the district Labour Party, made up of representatives of the branches and the CLPs and all the trade union affiliates, and they should set the policy and the campaigning priorities. So in terms of militant, I think Tony was right in terms of how they sort of reached out to people, like the miners, etc. But the militant also had influence within the trade unions within Liverpool as well, including the local authority trade unions. And so it wasn't just that, there were Labour Party members standing for council. They'd actually built amongst the actual proper movements. So when they had to organise demonstrations and even a strike at one point in support of the council, it was all united through the trade union movements as well. I think that's absolutely key. I think the other things that Militant did was, in terms of support for the miners, they were calling for the TUC to organise a one-day general strike as a kind of mass organising platform for the whole of the workers' movements. And they were also calling for all the other Labour councils to back them up in terms of setting the budgets and all the rest of it. So they did put the call out. I think it wasn't Militant's fault that other people didn't do that. I think they had a go. And if more people had listened to what Militant was saying at the time, we'd have a completely different country. And I think Thatcher could have gone. And look at the benefits that working people would have had because of that. Now, in terms of today, we've had massive cuts to the support grants from central government, because what the government are trying to do, they're almost trying to go back to the days of the Poplar council struggle, where rather than each council paying all their rates to central government, there then being a kind of formula which equalises the money, so that the rich boroughs aren't able to take the lion's share, and the poor boroughs can't raise enough money but have a greater need to kind of see to. They want to get rid of that mechanism and basically say to councils, look, you are your own standalone entity. You ain't going to get any funding from us. You have to raise all the money yourself. And so that means council tax going up. It means the various car parking charges and fines and all that become money-making schemes. And it also means that if they want anything done, they have to basically try and sell off council land to sort of private developers to kind of get anything moving, because they haven't got the funds to do it themselves. So they become little islands, and the problem with that is some councils are going to be richer than others, and so you're going to massively increase inequality if it's run like that. And yes, they are run like small businesses. In fact, some councils are even setting up their own kind of businesses to partner up with big developers. And I think the big issue in Haringey over the HDV was one of those things. So in terms of what we need to do, I think you have to have a fight back. You have to have a campaign, and I think the needs budget is a good thing to rally around. If by what we mean by needs budget is we say, look, these were our funds before austerity started. The government has basically robbed X amount. We want that money back, and then you have to build a vision of what you're going to do with that money. And the needs budget, so far as I understand it, is you go to the various groups of workers, the various residents in your area, and you hold a type of forum of sorts, and you use that to get people to think, what is it we actually need? What do we need if we want to stop homeless people dying on the streets, which is what happens in local authority areas now? What do we need to do to meet our housing needs, our social care needs, which has been highlighted, because of the coronavirus, etc. And you basically pull those people in to draw up what it is they want. And if you do that, they're much more likely to back you up when you're fighting for it. And it means that the struggle becomes more concrete. It's not just about figures and whatever for budget. It's about, this is what we are fighting for. This is what it's going to actually mean for you, and you've got the buy-in from the population to back you up when you go for your fight. So I mean, I really do salute the 47 in Liverpool for what we did. I think there's housing in Liverpool that has changed because of what they did. And even if they did eventually surcharge people and bar them from office, a lot of those houses and other developments that were done during that period are still there, and people are still getting the benefit from it. So nowhere else got that. So that's got to be worth it in and of itself. And I take people's point about it being a defensive struggle, but it was a time of where the capitalist class were on the offensive, and so defending was the first reaction, I guess. And it would have been interesting, actually, if the Soviet Union hadn't collapsed at the end of the 80s, early 90s, and with capitalism then going into a recession in the early 90s, what might have happened and what might have been different had that not happened. So I think I'll leave it there. Just the final point, really, as I say, when they're pushing through the austerity, they're also pushing through a kind of a model of local democracy, which is very different to local councils. They push this idea of mayors and police commissioners, kind of like one bloke, who it usually is, who basically controls everything, and he has a small cabinet around him of maybe 6 or 7 people, and they control everything. And then there's no real need, really, for the, I don't know, 50 or 60 odd councillors that you might have had before. And it's basically their job to then work out what private company is best placed to take on the services that the council provide. That's the kind of model that the Tories are trying to make us move towards, and that's part and parcel of the austerity drive and taking away the funding to encourage that kind of model. So I think we can fight back. I think we've got the NEC elections in the Labour Party coming up. I've thrown my hat into the ring to stand for them. And part of my programme is about not just dealing with the MPs, but through open selection, etc., but through dealing with the councillors and bringing in the proper district Labour parties again. So I'll finish it there. It's been fantastic discussion, and let's have some more of these.
Thanks, Alec. Liv also made the interesting point on the chat that the witch hunt is, of course, still going on and expanding now massively. And they're coming for the councillors at the moment. And 3 just in Brighton and Hove have been suspended in the last few days. And that will expand some more. We actually have a meeting on this issue next Tuesday, and I'm going to put it in the chat, where we're going to campaign for free speech and against, the campaign to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, which is with Norman Finkelstein, with Tariq Ali, with Jackie Walker, Tony Greenstein, Mark Wadsworth, and a few others. I'll put the link in the chat in a minute. So now to bring in Kevin to reply to a few things and sum up. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, comrades. Some very interesting questions and very interesting comments. Just for the train spotters amongst you, Tony had the Liverpool 47 banner behind him, and that's the one that comes along to our meetings. So, I was very glad he could mention the experiences there. I'd like to begin with some of the points that Alex made in relation to some of the questions that Jonathan Hooper asked, and in particular about, I suppose, what we might call our municipal programme, and in particular the idea of grassroots socialism and how, what sort of campaigns we should mount, not only for the defence of local services, but also for an alternative set of political structures. Alex makes the point about, local plans and about how we might, involve local people in drawing up plans for local democracy, for needs and so on. Excellent ideas. But those need, I think, to be more formalized in terms of a wider program of political reform, and in particular, a democratic program. Jonathan, you make the point about a federal settlement, and you know, quite how the form of that would go. Certainly the idea of a republic, and then the way that power is devolved, and the question of how that society is governed are very important ones. And I think that underpinning a lot of what we said here is about the nature of the state, and particularly the role of the local state. So I think that the questions you asked, Jonathan, do feed into a much wider question about the state and where power lies in society, particularly the nature of a parliamentary democracy. I think both Alec Price and Tony Rimmer make some very good points about internal party organisation, and in particular the role of district Labour parties. The district Labour parties were, an historic pattern in the Labour movement, bringing together both constituency Labour parties and trade unions. And the type of function of those parties was to control and to represent, or to control elected representatives. And what's interesting is that if we consider the way that power is distributed in the Labour movement, our movement began as a movement outside of the state. It began outside of councils and parliament. And when we elected people, we elected them to represent us. And so bodies like the District Labour Party were there to control them. In other words, that these councillors and indeed MPs were not there to go and represent themselves, and they certainly weren't there to promote themselves. They were going there as workers' representatives. So all sorts of demands for democratic controls over councillors and MPs, demands, for example, such as a workers' MP on a workers' wage, or that councillors, for example, not get extravagant expenses, and that these be monitored by the Labour movement, with the excess being returned to the movement and so on. These, I think, are all important demands, but they also need to be linked to the type of municipal programme that we're going to advance. And that programme, I think, has to be a positive one. It has to be a one of not just defensive struggles, but actually a positive idea of how we see socialist politics in the localities and what the sort of functions of local democracy could be. I think Alec also made an excellent point about the concentrations of power. And one of the points I was trying to bring in about the state in general was the way that the local state reflects changes in the wider state. The local state is, after all, part of the state. So the privatization, the turning of state functions into private services which are bought in, we've seen plenty of that in the current COVID crisis, where local authorities and other bodies are not able, or indeed are being frozen out of responding to that crisis, because of course companies like Serco, G4S, any number of organizations are dealing with functions which are really those of local administration. And I think that this again sort of points to the very central idea of the local state as representative of bigger changes which have taken place in the state generally. So the metro mayors, these super mayors that are elected, who've now become almost unaccountable to the Labour Party, who've become media figures who make policy at the drop of a hat. The concentration of power into cabinets, in which a handful of councillors around mayors, make the policy completely distant from the Labour Party. When any attempt is made to try and control them, or for example, when local Labour Party branches pass motions on local development or planning issues or on council policies, they're just simply ignored. So there's a battle for democracy, both in terms of local democracy, but also in terms of party democracy. The current struggles in Tower Hamlets are an excellent example of that, where we've got a Blairite carrying out all sorts of Tory and pro-capitalist policies. And that again shows the need for both the local municipal programme, but also the need for democratic control over these people in that way. What I was trying to do in my introduction was to talk about the way that the nature and the functions of local government have changed in the last century or so, from the time of Poplar through to these other struggles. And many of the questions that people have asked about finance and about the dependence of local government on central government all, I think, refer to this sort of point. Much of what's happened has in a sense, not only been accelerated in recent years, but of course it's been continued not only by the new Labour government of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, but also has been sort of positively welcomed by many Labour councillors, many of whom seem to be quite happy to play the part of facilitators, of mediators, as people who can manage this system, who can wheel and deal, who can bid for grants, and can act as sort of brokers. And so I think some of the dangers of some of the slogans of municipal socialism and some of the dangers of ideas of trying to build socialism from the grassroots up is that all that we're attempting to do at the very best is to ameliorate some of the worst aspects of capitalism, and in some ways to act as a facilitator for particular local forms of capitalism. So I think that what we as activists in the labour movement need to do is to build both on the democratic demands of control over our councillors, but also to look at the nature of what those councillors are doing in the context of the wider crisis of capitalism, in the context of a wider socialist agenda. That means that local government can't be sort of sidelined off. It's an important area of struggle, and it's an important platform for us to advance socialist politics. But it has to be part of a much wider set of socialist policies, a democratic and a socialist program that transforms society at large. And the successful struggles, or the struggles that were successful in raising consciousness, actually did do that. That means I think we need to study much of the history of these movements, and I hope that tonight's discussion begins that. I was very well aware that the fine details of what happened in Liverpool were not covered. That would have probably taken me an hour, but I'm glad that Tony and other comrades came in on that. And a real balance sheet of both the strengths and the weaknesses of that struggle, I think, would be useful at future meetings. But that may be for other comrades to take up later in the summer. Anyway, thank you, comrades, for your contributions.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was as always a very excellent introduction and discussion, I think.